The President. The Chief Executive. The Chief Executive will first address the Council. Mr. President, members, this is the 12th occasion that I attend a Council meeting in this session. On the 11th of October, I delivered my first policy address. And then, counting today, I've attended 4 Chief Executives' question and answer sessions. And since January this year, on 7 occasions, I attended the Chief Executive's question time. Members might recall that this arrangement for me to attend Council meetings more is for me to respond directly, positively, to the suggestions of the Committee on Rules of Procedure. But of course, this is also in line with the new governance style of this term of the government. An important element of the new governance of style is for us to respect the functions of the legislature to exercise check and balance on the executive. We would like to have a platform for communication and cooperation. Through good communication, we can build the basis for cooperation, and we could strive for consensus with with the public's best interest in mind, so we're able to act on decisions we've made. I'm glad that I and my team have achieved results in the past year with this new style of governance. In 2017 to 2018, we passed 27 government bills. Compared to 2016 to 2017, 12 government bills were passed, so the number is doubled. And then compared to the second session of the last term of the government, that is the 2013 to 14 session, there were 18 government bills passed. So again, this year the number is much higher. I note that the Deputy Chairman of the Health Committee, Mr. Dennis Kwok, would like us to submit the rest of the bills as soon as possible. We will certainly follow up on that. On bills passed, some were most controversial, but they are closely related to the developments of Hong Kong. For example, the Guangzhou-Shenzhen-Hong Kong Express Rail Link co-location bill and the medical practitioners registration amendment bill. Now, so far, the Finance Committee has passed over 80 works projects amounting to $159.6 billion. There are still 4 sessions of the Finance Committee meetings. I hope that for the whole session we're able to achieve works amounting to $170 billion. Apart from public works projects, the Finance Committee has also considered many of the funding proposals announced in the policy address and the 2018 to 19 budget on fund injections to various funds. The amount involved is no less than $27 billion. So these are hard-earned achievements, and or put by Ms. Starry Lee, is a slightly more efficient way of dealing with matters. That shows to some extent there's been improvement in the relationship between the executive and the legislature. But what is more practical is that there have been far more meetings scheduled, so members have been working hard. The Finance Committee, the Public Works Subcommittee, and the Establishment Subcommittee have held additional meetings since March this year. That's an addition of close to 100 hours of meeting time. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank all members, including the President, the Chairman of the various committees, the Secretariat, and the Legal Service Division of this Secretariat for all your hard work. Mr. President, members, every time when I attend a council meeting, I didn't have to prepare too much for the session because it's really hard to guess what questions might be raised at the session, and so I don't want to give additional work to my colleagues. But the follow-up afterwards is something we take very seriously. Now, 120 questions were asked in this session, and there is a progress report on follow-up actions and all these questions, and I will personally peruse the report. For example, facilitation measures in relation to the Bay Area development, we are following up on the various issues. If necessary, we will discuss with the Guangdong provincial government, also put forward our request to the Central People's Government. On lift repair and maintenance and supervision, I will be chairing a meeting myself later. Hopefully before the policy address or in the policy address, I'll be able to respond to that. Also, members have expressed concern about the operation of shelter workshop. I've undertaken to follow up on that personally. On issues related to myself, for example, some members have asked to meet with me to improve the environment for elderly homes or other homes, or to share with officials my experience in answering questions. Well, I have actually taken about all these requests. As you might know, when I was a secretary or chief secretary, I not just before I was a chief executive, I said I enjoyed coming to this council because I would like to listen to members' views and answer members' questions. And for views and questions put by members, that will help me to get a better tap on public sentiment. Now, there are two, I would like to sum up my short speech as this in relation to foreign relations of our country. That is, if we share the same aspirations, we are partners. But if we try for consensus and accommodate differences, we're also partners. So I hope we will be able to enhance mutual trust, and then we will respect each other and do something concrete for the public. Thank you. Dr. Ann Chan. Thank you, Mr. President. My question for this chief executive is one I will ask with a heavy heart. As you know, cancer is the #1 killer in Hong Kong, killer disease in Hong Kong. Every year there are some 30,000 plus new cases, but there are insufficient resources with, and also it seems that more and more younger people are contracting cancer. Recently, there was a case, a young man, 32 years old, approached me. He's got a brain tumor. It's been a year already. Recently, I accompanied him to the church. Much concern was shown to him by other churchgoers, and he cried out loud because for the past year, the doctor just told him, you've only got 6 months left, or maybe your life could be extended by a few more months at most. He felt that the government did not show him concern, society did not show him concern. The Cancer Prevention, there's a Cancer Prevention Association. I recently visited their facilities. They have some family support programs, but they're not able to expand the program because they don't have sufficient funds. In the past, the Jockey Club funded their programs, but it seems that the Jockey Club no longer The other problem is about not being able to afford drugs. I'm sure the chief executive has learned about this. Some people are not able to afford the targeted therapy. or they would just drain their family resources, so they rather not take the therapy and wait to die. Why? Why would they want to do that? Now, Hong Kong compared to other countries in terms of the percentage of drug subsidy. Now, in the States, it's 100% subsidy, and the EU, there are 26 cancer drugs. Dr. Ann Chan, please come to your question, please. You've already spent more than 2.5 minutes. Even if we take the safety net funding, that's just 23% of subsidy as a whole. I hope the Chief Executive will also speed up the process for including drugs in the formulary. Right now, the median wait duration is 43 months. Dr. Ann Chan, please come to your question. And the longest time is 61 months, 5 years, Chief Executive. Chief Executive, please. Thank you, Dr. Chan, for your question. The public healthcare system in Hong Kong is under immense pressure because it's a highly subsidized system. In terms of hospital services, the hospital authority is taking care of 80% or even 90% of the patients. It's the same with specialist treatment. The service is under immense pressure. So that's why when I first assumed post, I already stated that we need to plow in more resources into the public healthcare system. Let's not talk about, healthcare financing or other options. We have a good public healthcare system, and we have dedicated medical personnel. So we should therefore consolidate the system. That's why in the 2018 to 19 financial year, Dr. Chen, as you can see, we have substantially increased resource support for the hospital authority. We also have a new model of funding. We have regard not just to population increase, but demographic changes to calculate funding. That means we have regard to the increase in the elderly population as well. And also, there are new diseases, there's advancement in medical sciences and so on. We may not be able to cover everything, but we'll do our very best. As for including drugs in the HA drug formulary, can we speed up that process? Because when drugs are in the drug formulary, for those with lesser means, they could then have access to drug, or of course we're also working hard to provide more support through the Samaritan Fund and so on. But of course at the end is prevention is better than cure. That's why in promoting primary health care, this government is committed. I hope members will support our effort to do more in primary health care. This will then lessen the burden on the public healthcare system and the hospital system. Dr. Ann Chan, can the Chief Executive undertake that you will set up a dedicated fund to support cancer patients and their families? So there could be NGOs, helping cancer patients. Chief Executive. Well, there are various funds now available for application. And there are also groups that support cancer patients, so I don't see whether there's really the need to set up a separate fund. But of course, for existing funds, if there is insufficient funding, we could inject more resources into these funds as we've done in the past. Thank you. Mr. Tony Chair. Thank you, Chief Executive. Now, in your election manifesto, you said you want Hong Kong to be a greener and more livable city. But around the world, cities are trying to provide more space with better ventilation and visibility. But then we are spending $1.7 billion in the town center of Yuen Long. This is a mammoth footbridge system. So my question for the Chief Executive is it the case that your principal officials team or your civil service team don't share your philosophy or your election manifesto? Or is it because for some of the projects they were decided upon by the previous government or the government before that, so your government just wouldn't bother and just let it be.
Yeah.
Chief Executive, President, thank you, Mr. Chair, for your question. To build Hong Kong into a livable city remains the principle of this term government. I was the Secretary for Development for 5 years, and I do understand what is meant by progressive development, meaning that we have to balance the needs of development against the city's development. As Mr. Chair was saying, we need to create public open space, ventilation corridors, and also to protect the visual landscape of the city. We will still place emphasis on this task. But with regard to this 1.7 billion worth of Yuen Long footbridge, it has its own background, and there is also the need from the community. And we have to balance that against engineering considerations. I have heard many views from members, especially a group of members led by Mr. Chair. I know you have many views on that. That is why I have asked the Secretary for Transport and Housing and also the Director of Highways to take it up with the 5 professional bodies to see how we can come to a consensus so we can satisfy the aspirations of the district and also give play to the need for a quality city. Mr. Chair, Chief Executive, together with the professional societies I represent, I know that the community would like to have this project embarked upon as soon as possible. And exactly because of that, we are very disappointed, because in 2014, the administration said that this project would start in 2016, but you have dragged on for 4 years before you sought funding from the Legislative Council. Should this happen again in future, I hope the SAR government can take up the issue at an earlier juncture with professional bodies. You should communicate with them so that we can try to find a way to build projects so that we can build a livable city, as you said, Chief Executive, and also we can meet the district's needs. Thank you. Chief Executive, thank you, Mr. Chair. I subscribe to that approach of doing things. My principal officials and I do go by that spirit, as you have heard me say many times on public occasions and also here in Council. Many controversial issues that come to the Council are also very controversial in the community, so we cannot avoid members' very differing views when these issues come to the Council. So if we can take up issues with district organizations or professional bodies at an early stage so that we can forge a consensus by addressing the different views, this will be very positive for the relationship between the executive and the legislature. We will insist on doing that. Mr. Horace Cheung. Recently, at the Court of Final Appeal, there was a judgment reached for the QT case that the Director of Immigration should not reject the issue of a dependent visa because the QT case is not within the list of spouse in the list of dependents. The CFA said very clearly that this has nothing to do with entering into a marriage by same-sex marriage. A legal and valid marriage is still marriage between a man and a woman. But then in the ruling, the court is also of the view that even if marriage and civil partnership are called different names, however, they are both recognized in UK laws. And civil union, well, it may be different in name from marriage, but it is nothing different from marriage. And with regard to this issue, the Director of Immigration has always acted according to the definition of marriage in Hong Kong, and that is marriage between a man and a woman. However, this judgment has overthrown the decision of the Director of Immigration. And in society, there is a lot of debate as to whether this case will become a precedent in that we are giving recognition to civil union entered into in overseas countries, so that in a way we are legalizing same-sex marriage. In this regard, can the Chief Executive let the public know that apart from reviewing the immigration for dependents in order to obey this FA ruling. I'd like to ask whether the SAR government would also review the adoption of children, welfare and housing aspects, so that when you have to consider the factor of spouse, you might be subject to such judicial challenges. Chief Executive. Thank you, President. As we all know, the issue of same-sex marriage is very controversial in Hong Kong. And this is not something the administration can handle alone. We have to consider the different views in society. But on this case mentioned by Mr. Horace Cheung, I must say here that the administration we respect the judgment of the CFA. That is why we are studying the ruling of the CFA, and we will seek our legal advice in order to do follow-up action. I also hope that we can decide on follow-up action as soon as possible. But this case has nothing to do with any challenge against Hong Kong's marriage ordinance. In the ruling of the CFA, this is stated very clearly. It is just about the enforcement of immigration policy by the direction of immigration. As you know, we have certain principles behind our immigration policy to attract overseas talents and also to facilitate family reunion, and whether there is any discrimination or unfairness. So it has to do with immigration policy. At present, the SAR government has no plans to, as Mr. Horace Cheung said, extend this case to other social policies or to trigger study in other aspects. Thank you, Mr. Horace Cheung. President, I agree that in this case, the court did not question the definition of marriage in Hong Kong, that it should be between a man and a woman. But in this case, the court is of the view that in terms of public policies, like the immigration policy, if a spouse is involved, whether this is a reason for unfairness, so that the court is saying no to that policy. I'd like to ask the Chief Executive whether in other areas of public policy, if people apply to come to Hong Kong in the capacity of a spouse, I'd like to ask you whether you would also study those policies so as to ensure that you will not be subject to legal challenge. Chief Executive. Mr. Cheung, I'm afraid I don't want to directly answer your question in detail because, as I said, we are now studying the ruling of the court and we need to seek legal advice. At this stage, it is not appropriate for me to comment on the policies. Mr. Gary Fan, Chief Executive, last week at the question time, I proposed to you that we should pack land policy and population policy. I said you should develop brownfield sites and also limit the people from outside Hong Kong buying property in Hong Kong, and also to slash the one-way permit. You said that we should not prevent family reunion. And you said, Mr. Fan, I hope you have a sympathetic heart. But see ye, when Hong Kong people have to save up for 19 years before they can buy property, and that is without eating or buying clothes, when the waiting queue for public housing is longer and longer, when people are living in nano flats or subdivided units, when our MTR is crowded every day, who is showing sympathy to Hong Kong people? When the SAR government cannot have the approval rights on one-way permits, then you cannot put an end to fake marriage and forged document. This will also have an impact on applicants for one-way permits. And given limited land resources in Hong Kong, how can we allow 50,000 people to emigrate every year? And you are not including the tech task scheme and also non-Hong Kong graduates staying in Hong Kong for employment. And altogether, you are increasing our population by 85,000 every year. Chief Executive, when you, together with the pro-establishment camp, emphasize that young people should go to the Greater Bay Area to seek development and also to work, and also elderly people should go to the Greater Bay Area to spend their twilight years, then why is it that the one-way permit application cannot allow families to be reunited in the Greater Bay Area. Why not? You always emphasize that the Greater Bay Area is developing so fast that you can have a 1 hour living circle. Why can't we have a 1 hour reunion circle? Chief Executive. Mr. Fan is talking about two issues. One, population policy, including the one-way permit issue. Last week, I responded to a question on population policy, and then Mr. Gary Fan just mentioned property prices. He said that we should not allow overseas people to buy property in Hong Kong. As for the former, my stance is clear, and it did not start with last week. You remember a few years ago when we had a public discussion on retirement protection, the population policy issue was raised. Mr. Gary Fan and the people he represents have always been of the view that we should control or forbade one-way permit people to come to Hong Kong for family reunion. On this issue, my stance is clear. Hong Kong is entering into an era where our population is aging rapidly. If our economic development has to continue, we need more impetus. Of course, they come here mainly for family reunion, but then those that come are of a younger age, and by they have a higher education standard, and they can add to Hong Kong's labor force. In fact, many places need this kind of population increase so that the economic development can go forward. As to the second issue, it is not as you said, and that is to control or deal with property prices. I remember the FS said this, and I also said this, and that is to further control the sale of Hong Kong property to overseas people. We can look at it again. We can always look at it. And if our tough measures are no longer tough, that they have lost their effect, then when we have such a short supply of property, we can, of course, think of other policies and measures. This has nothing to do with the population policy. Last week, I talked about sympathy or compassion. Now, that is for real. In Hong Kong, we have a family reunion policy. Say, Mr. Fan, if you have married a non-Hong Kong person from Canada, from Singapore, this person can come to Hong Kong for family reunion in the capacity of a dependent. But of course, on the mainland, we have a very big population, and also it is stipulated in the basic law that we should have a controlled one-way permit system so that they can come in batches. Well, a spouse waiting to come to Hong Kong has to wait for more than 2-3 years now to come from the mainland. So this is what I mean by compassion. Mr. Fan, the SAR government cannot effectively control the inflow of overseas capital. That is why our property prices are spiraling. You do not have an effective population policy and to control the influx of non-local people. That is why our resources, including housing resources, are affected. From 1997, we have an injection of almost 1 million people. And last year, there was an increase of 10 million. Mr. Fan, please only ask a short supplement. And with regard to one-way permit, it is about 47,000. It is about 5 times. So how can you turn a blind eye to this? How can you depeg population policy from the supply of land and housing? This is dereliction of duty on the part of the administration. Well, we are dealing with both. It's just that we are going in an opposite direction from yours. Hong Kong's economic development has to continue to develop. We need more labor, and therefore we should welcome those people who come for family reunion. And if in the end we need more schools, medical services and housing, then we should develop land, and that is why we are developing land. Mr. Fan, if you remember, when we studied, Singapore measured 500 kilo. Mr. Fan, please sit down. Please sit down. Your time is up. Mr. Jeremy Tam.
Chief Executive, the average living space for Hong Kong people is 161 square feet. But if you are a male indigenous villager, you can apply to build a village house of 2,100 square feet. Now, there are 3,030 380 hectares of land zoned as village housing land. And that includes 932 hectares of government land. And what does that mean? It's an equivalent of 44 Taikushing. Now, that's a serious waste of public resources. An opinion poll was conducted before, and there's demand to abolish the village housing rights and also to build public housing on government land. When you were the Secretary for Development, you said you a tough fighter. And you said that it's not possible for the small house policy to remain forever. Now you are the chief executive, but you made no mention of a review of the small house policy. Is it because you dare not take up the fight, or you don't want to take up the fight? Now, public opinions are clear. The public would like a review on small house policy so land could be released for the construction of public housing. 2 months ago, at the same spot here, you said in your governance philosophy there is not such a term as vested interest. There's only a term public interest. So this is a major public interest. Would you, on that basis, review the small house policy? Chief Executive, I would like to thank Mr. Tam for raising the question. This gives me another chance to clarify that. Now, I did not dub myself a tough fighter. It's just a coincidence, actually. It was at Hung Yee Kok gathering, and then someone said that there's an official who is really tough, and so if you have anything, approach her. That was in 2006. I came back from the UK to become the Permanent Secretary for Home Affairs at the time, and I was in charge of rural affairs. And it's true, in my own vocabulary, there's not such a term as vested interest. That's only the term of public interest. But then there's also a term of acting in accordance with the law. As you know, the small house policy has been in place for more than 40 years. There is now a judicial review going on. So that's why at this stage, the government is not in a position to comment publicly on the matter because that ruling may have an impact on our policies. Mr. Tam, yes, I know that judicial review you refer to will start at the end of this year, but this is about the traditional definition. It's not about the small house policy. Since 1972, is it the case that the small house policy has never changed? No, it's actually changed. Instead of 25 square feet, it's become 27 square feet. Now, how many people are actually waiting to build small houses? 8,548 applications. So this is a long queue, and then you may need 110 hectares of land to accommodate all these applications. In the past decade, from 3,100 hectares has now become 3,380 hectares, so an increase of 220 hectares of village land. Mr. Tam, please come to your question. So we have only limited land. You need to come to a decision to address this small house issue. But the judicial review is not really about small house policy, so that's a difference. Chief Executive. Well, when the time is right, I believe I and the Development Bureau will deal with the matter, but this is not the right time. Yesterday, the Secretary for Development responded to your questions on the small house policy, the 3,380 hectares, and that the number keeps increasing. I think he tried to explain what that exactly means. Mr. Poon Siu Ping. At the beginning of the year, there was a winter flu epidemic. As hospitals were overcrowded, and medical staff suffered immense pressure. The chief executive responded quickly and gave $500 billion to the hospital authority so it could relocate manpower resources to relieve the pressure. Now, the summer flu epidemic usually would happen in the end of July or August, and so the government has appealed to the public to take the flu shot. But I don't want to see a repeat of overcrowded hospitals and overworked medical staff again. Now, of course, there's always been a shortage of medical staff, but there's also a high wastage rate of frontline doctors. Last year, the 7 clusters of hospitals hired 2,465 people, but there's a wastage of 2,111 people. And so also for other allied medical professionals and so on, there's also wastage. The unions told me that these personnel has not been given fair treatment. That's why it affects their services provided to the patients as well. This covers ward assistants and other grades. So would the Chief Executive ask the Hospital Authority to review the relevant staffing structure and conditions and service so you could retain staff? Chief Executive. In the first question raised by Dr. Ann Chan, I said that the hospitals under the Hospital Authority are under immense pressure. That's why in the near term we have provided additional resources. In the medium to long term, we have addressed the imbalance in the healthcare system. That is, we are putting too little resources in the primary healthcare system. That's why there's this problem with the hospitals. Of course, we have to address the manpower issue as well. As Mr. Poon might have noted, that we plan to increase the number of student places for the 2 medical schools. We're going to increase training for other healthcare staff. And then there should be a self-financing tertiary institute that will start a physiotherapist program this year. But it takes time to train the talents. So all I can say is that we will keep working hard. And something we can do in the near term is to bring in doctors from overseas, or doctors and other healthcare personnel. But unfortunately, there is contention in the community about that. Now, in the past year, we passed the Medical Registration Amendment Bill. So the Hospital Authority, the Department of Health, will be able to bring it to allow a limited 3-year registration for overseas doctors. The Secretary for Food and Health and myself and others are actively promoting the scheme. We would like to attract graduates from overseas to come to Hong Kong, especially those who were originally from Hong Kong. We hope they to come back and serve in our hospitals and relieve the burden there. Mr. Poon, the Hospital Authority management has never responded to the question of the supporting grades. Some unions have asked to meet with the senior management for several months now, and they still haven't got a meeting. Now, some unions are now planning a strike, so I hope the matter will be addressed as soon as possible without affecting patients. I'll ask Professor Sophia Chen to follow up on that. I always believe that it's fine to have different positions. As I said in my opening remarks, I said it's all about being sincere in discussion. If there's no meeting, of course, it's difficult to have good communication. I hope the Secretary for Food and Health will follow up on that. Thank you. Mr. Stephen Ho. In the last Chief Executive question time, the Chief Executive responded to the question of fishermen getting on and off at typhoon shelter. But that's still a difference between what you said and what they've asked for, so please follow up on that. Just now, other members talk about land supply. Of course, the government is well aware of the scarcity of land. So you are trying to create more land to meet different demands for housing, for commercial users, or even for recreational users and so on. There's a task force on land supply, and now they've come up with a consultation on 18 options. Now the government's been talking about reclamation. There are other options such as rezoning, agricultural farming land, and so on. But then these two options, the option will have a severe impact on those in the industry. So my question for the Chief Executive is, from your side, how can you help to lessen the impact on those in these two trades, especially those working in the sea? Because if the government does not know what the actual needs of the industries are, then all the policies you propose would be wrong. Chief Executive. On each of the land options put forward, of course, that may lead to concern of the relevant trades, and they might even oppose it. That's why there's need for us to have rational discussion in the community so that we could reach general consensus. Now, we can't have complete consensus, but at least we have a general consensus so Hong Kong could move forward. In the long run, reclamation, offshore reclamation that I mentioned, seems to be inevitable because we're talking about the long term. We're not talking about the next 5 or 10 years. We're talking about the long term. In other cities, they have to go for this option too for development. For example, Singapore, I mentioned that just now. Now, if some of the options may have impact on the relevant trades, of course, we would like to know in advance what the impact might be, so we could lessen the adverse impact as far as possible. Now, Mr. Stephen Ho represents the agriculture and fisheries sectors. Now, before the task force discussion is concluded, please help us to gather the views of the agriculture and fisheries sector. So we'll see if there are any ways we could mitigate the impact for any options we go for. Thank you. Mr. Stephen Ho. Well, we've worked very hard to foster communication between our sectors and the government. Now, it's not that we will not want to move or we won't, budge an inch, but rather the trades need the government support for their development. So that's why I think we need breakthroughs. What about the Hengqin district in Macau? Can we say apply to the Central People's Government so that we could develop together, we could develop waters together with, say, the Bay Area, and so fishermen would have more operating space because they could travel a bit further. Or what about farmland? Yes, some of the farmland may be given up, but there's need for government to have new planning. Because every time when there's a new development area, there will always be a few farmers who say they won't move at all. But it's because the government has always left the agriculture sector to its own devices all along. So you need to give them more support. Chief Executive, I can appreciate that Mr. Ho needs to fight for the interests of the sectors, but I don't think you can say that we haven't done anything at all for the sectors. We have various schemes on the promotion of agriculture and fisheries. Now, of course, on what Mr. Ho has suggested just now, we'll actively consider them. But whether it's about open storage or squatter areas or farmland or whatever, whenever the government wants land for development, if people say they won't move or they want rehousing or resettlement, then it will lead to a problem because it's exactly because we don't have enough land. We need the land for development. So that's why the resettlement will be challenging. Now, for Bay Area, you mentioned that the Bay Area will bring about new opportunities. We will actually consider that too. But are we going to go for the option like the Hengqin options you mentioned? Well, we can't really respond to that at this point because we need to take it up with the Guangdong government or the Macau government. Thank you. Mr. Paul Chair. Thank you, President. Now, lately, the hottest news, there are three pieces. Two have to do with football, that is the Thai young football team or the World Cup. But the other issue of the greatest concern must be the trade war. We know that the Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development have been meeting with SMEs and also so on. And ASEAN has become our largest trading partner too. And then there's work involving the credit insurance body and so on. And then there are ways to expand the domestic market. So there are various schemes included in the ASEAN scheme, and this may help Hong Kong. But apart from that, I don't see any visionary schemes from the government. Now, Hong Kong practices one country, two systems. There is the Hong Kong-China Policy Act, That's the Hong Kong Policy Act, and so Hong Kong is treated differently than China. Recently, with the support of the country, that's introduction of high technology such as the $50 billion the funds, technology fund, and also there's a new plan of the country to promote technology and homegrown inventions and so on. And then we also talk about Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and so on. Now, these may just become defense strategies now. What about considering the unique features of our economy so we could find a new niche in economic development?
Chief Executive, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an issue for the entire world. There is no winner in any trade war. This time around, the U.S. has launched waves and waves of policies, and the entire world has shown concern. The economic globalization and also the World Trade Organization agreements are also dealt a blow, and people are worried. Just now, Mr. Chair was able to give a rundown of the measures that the SAR government has taken in a very short while. Well, I like to say that I do think that Mr. Edward Yao has been working so hard after this was started to discuss with the trade associations and chambers, and so that we can try to lessen the difficulties for the sector. As you were asking me whether we can have more proactive, aggressive, or visionary measures so that we are not only in a defensive position. Actually, yes. After we have taken office, we have adopted a proactive stance. And this is in several aspects. Number one, we are very proactive in integrating ourselves into the development of the country so that we can have more economic opportunities, whether it is the Belt and Road Initiative and the Greater Bay Area. Together with my principal officials, we are spending a lot of time in order to secure more development opportunities for Hong Kong's sectors. Number two, we'd like to diversify Hong Kong's economy. We used to rely on the four pillars, finance, maritime, and also logistics, and also professional services. And I can say that in the past year, we have done our very best to work on scientific and technology development, whether it is our immigration policy and other policies. We have put in $78 billion already, and we are promoting Hong Kong to other places. And as the chief executive, I have been attending so many different ceremonies which are related to innovation and technology, and we have got very good response. On my trip to France, I attended in a ceremony, the signing of a memorandum between the Hong Kong Science Park, Hong Kong U, and the French body, which is the Pasteur Society. So, and this was secured within the first year, and I'm very comforted. Secondly, we like to enhance Hong Kong's international status. We hope that we can have a bigger market in the world map. First of all is ASEAN. In November, we signed the Free Trade Pact between ASEAN and Hong Kong. So we are doing a lot to open up the ASEAN market. We are setting up the third Economic and Trade Office, which will be in Bangkok of Thailand. And we are doing other things at the same time. I have been taking overseas trips, and in fact, this is part of our progressive or proactive policy. Mr. Chair, we are not showing a lot of concrete results because this is just 1 year, but we are going in that direction, and we are working hard. Mr. Chair, during the Chinese, U.S., and North Korea conflict, the Premier of Singapore was able to negotiate in the gaps, and he might have gained from it. And also during the Korean War, Mr. Fok Ying Tong was able to move around military resources so as to help the country and Hong Kong. Now, I'm not going to say that we should take advantage of the country's predicaments, but perhaps we can make use of our political position to help Hong Kong to develop using our own conditions. You were talking about manpower, resources, finances, and also innovation and technology. This is important. Chief Executive, do you have personal policies, meaning that you can make use of Hong Kong's position so that we should not follow too close this trade war and so that Hong Kong may stand to suffer? Well, Mr. Jay, I won't say that Hong Kong is in this interesting relationship. In fact, ever since our unification with the country in 1997, I would say that we have enjoyed unique advantages because of one country, two systems. We have independent judicial and legal systems. We have an advantage in legal arbitration and mediation. So when we face challenges, we must leverage on the advantage of one country, two systems. Dr. Pierre Chan.
This university to carry out laboratory tests on 13 e-cigarettes from October 2015 to February 2016. The test found that the e-cigarettes contain harmful chemicals, which are associated with thyroid hormone disruption, reduction of fertility, and affect fetal development. In addition, the Food and Health Bureau commissioned a survey of primary and secondary school students between November 2016 and last June, which found 29,380 teenagers had tried e-cigarettes, with 2,770 still using them. Among primary 4 to 6 pupils, 2,340 had tried vaping. Worryingly, e-cigarettes advertising is directly mainly at young people. In recent years, we have also seen a huge increase in the number of people using emerging products like heat-not-burn tobacco as a substitute to conventional e-cigarettes. Do you have the resolve to follow the example of Macau and Singapore to enact a total ban on e-cigarettes?
Well, first of all, thank you.
Chief Executive.
First of all, let me assure Dr. Chan that we agree. We agree with the medical profession that e-cigarettes and other new tobacco products, including this heat-not-burn products, they release toxic substances and are harmful to health. So we don't have any difference as far as health protection is concerned. And that's why the Food and Health Bureau is proposing to strengthen regulation such that these products are being regulated at least on par with the conventional cigarettes for the protection of public health. Right now, the Secretary for Food and Health is consulting the sector, listening to various views, and we hope to take into account these views and introduce amendments to the Smoking Public Health Ordinance in the coming legislative session. But as far as a complete ban is concerned, Hong Kong does have to recognize her trade obligations in an international environment. Because if conventional cigarettes are even more harmful, but they are allowed to be sold in Hong Kong under certain regulation, to go into a total ban of another form of tobacco product, which is less harmful medically, would raise many challenges. So we have to really strike a balance. But as I said right now, the Secretary for Food and Health is consulting, so you are welcome, and all of you are welcome to provide us with your views and opinions on this subject.
Dr.
Chan.
Wording is wrong. This is not such thing, less harmful. This is harmful. And what are the factors and hurdles considered by the government in not making such a decision of the banning? Does tobacco industry's interest outweigh public health and public interest?
Well, definitely not. Definitely not. I have already mentioned the obligation under the global trade environment that we have to take into account. We certainly would not subject ourselves to any lobbying from the tobacco industry.
Mr. Leung Yiu-chung. President, this Monday on the 9th of July, the Subcommittee on Markets and Public Housing Markets, many deputations came to speak to us. they expressed a strong dissatisfaction with the operation of Link. Recently, the Link Monitor and also the Social Policy Institute of Polytechnic University did a survey. 80% of respondents felt that Link had a negative impact on people, and 85% did not agree that you could not do anything about Link. And 75% people actually wanted the administration to repurchase Link. Chief Executive, of course, this is a very old issue. This is about Link. But faced with very clear public opinion and actually public grief, Chief Executive, can you come up with concrete measures and policy objectives within your term to tackle this very big hurdle? Chief Executive. Thank you, Mr. Leung. With regard to Link and concerns of the residents, I have always been aware of it. And when I was the CS4A, I met two chairmen, one after another, of Link, hoping that they will discharge their corporate social responsibility. For now, our response is, when there is a lack of public market in new towns, we have to build public markets. This is the policy of this government. About siting, we are working at full steam. We hope that within the year, we can announce a market for Tin Shui Wai. And then if we can make it for Tung Chung, we will also make the announcement as soon as possible. And in other new development areas, including Hong Shui Kiu, we will again build public markets. On the other hand, to tackle this issue, I already said, if I still have residual powers, meaning that when public car parks and public shopping malls and markets were divested, if the administration still has residual powers, and meaning that if Link wants to do anything but only with the approval of the administration, we have applied the rules very strictly, and every time we have put public residents' interests at the front, and we would not give them approval easily, and even we can charge waiver fees to give the approval. We did not do it because we want to protect the interests of the residents. As for repurchasing Link, you did not mention it, but I'm sure you wanted that to be done. That is not feasible because the asset level of Link has so risen. Are we going to put so much public resources in order to respond to that aspiration of the public? So we have a direction for handling the issue. That is clear. But it's just that whether there is more we can do so we can help residents who think that their daily lives are affected. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung, President, the CE has always said that she is working for the public's interest and that there will be 3 markets that will be built. But the thing is, government property has become a tool for speculation. And many residents think that you are contravening the housing ordinance, and that is you should provide reasonable facilities for public rental housing residents. Now that Link has got these properties, it is not operating normally. Very often, there are so many vacant units in the shopping malls. Now, how can you still follow the housing ordinance by providing reasonable facilities to the public and at the same time preventing government property from becoming a tool for speculation? Chief Executive, to answer Mr. Leung, Hong Kong is a place where we act according to the law and we respect the spirit of contract. Therefore, I cannot arbitrarily take measures in order to achieve certain ends. However, what is within the power of the administration that we can do, whether it is by policies or by plowing in resources, I'm willing to do it. I have no intention to defend the way of doing business of Link, but I myself went to certain malls and markets operated by Link, and I also interviewed certain residents. It is not that everybody thought that there was exploitation on the part of Link. Some residents did think that there was an improvement in operation. We are faced with a business entity and its business operation, and so we have to respect that spirit. Mr. Ronick Chan.
按金管局
Chief Executive. Now, according to the plan announced by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority in September this year, there will be a cross-bank, cross-operator, single platform for e-payment. There is a faster payment system, which it is called, will be commissioned in September, according to Mr. Norman Chan, the Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. After this payment system is launched, if, say, a group of friends have dinner together, no one needs to take out cash to chip in. Even for those without an electronic purse, they will be able to make real-time payment. That means we're making a big step forward towards cashless payment or e-payment. So, would you be introducing others or informing others about this important development? What about people who are not familiar with electronic payments, such as the elderly and so on? How can you help the public better understand the new payment technology, so this technology could become popular among the people soon? Chief Executive. Well, I'm not good with technology, Mr. Chan. Since you mentioned it, as I said in the opening remarks, I try not to disappoint you as far as possible. So in the coming months, I'll work very hard to learn to use the electronic purse. But am I the best person to promote it? Maybe not. Let me talk to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and see whether there are good ways to promote the technology of electronic purse, and then Hong Kong could become a smart city more quickly. Mr. Ronick Chan. Apart from publicity and education of local residents, every year there are several tens of millions of visitors to Hong Kong. Would the government consider ways to help overseas or mainland visitors to learn about this change in payment methods? Thank you, Mr. Chan. I will ask the Financial Secretary in the Hong Kong Embassy to consider it. Mr. Eddie Chu. Thank you, Chief Executive. The big land debate. Now, the government has been promoting public-private partnership all along. But as soon as people hear this PPP, there are a lot of grievances, are brought up. Now, in 1999, the government signed a contract with the Hong Kong City Land. The government has to keep pumping funds into it. And then there are 60 hectares of land lying idle for 20 years. That's supposed to be for phase 2 development. And then in 2004, there's divestment of assets. And so there's become public-private, public housing and markets. And then so the government wouldn't know what to do if you want to promote even further PPP. Now, I want to talk about the example of Ma Wan. In 1997, there's a public-private development project of Park Island at Ma Wan. At the time, the developer promised to provide proper ferry and bus services, and there's also supposed to be a theme park. For phase 1 theme park, no one visits it, and phase 2 theme park, we never hear about it anymore. The developer said because there's not enough patronage, so the park is running at a loss. I don't know if the Chief Executive is aware of this. Recently, for the ferry service between Ma Wan and Central during non-peak hours, there's talk of reducing the service frequency, and that's why there are thousands of middle-class residents staging a protest. Imagine at Ma Wan there are 1,000 middle-class residents staging a protest because they want to be able to take a ferry home. Isn't that ironic? And then the very next day, all of a sudden there's a substantial reduction of bus service. People have to wait 45 minutes to take the shuttle bus. Mr. Chu, please come to your question. So the developer is now not honoring its promise, and for the 10,000 plus residents in Park Island, they are suffering every day. Okay, so when PPP fails and developers don't honor their promise, it doesn't mean the government can also be allowed not to honor the promise. So what would the government do to make sure that there are reasonable ferry and public transport services for Ma Wan residents? Chief Executive. Well, Mr. Chu, I've been paying attention to this issue lately because some residents from Ma Wan sent me an email directly to tell me the story you just told me. Now, my answer, the principle is the same actually for the government with PPP. As long as the government still has the power or we have something in hand, then definitely we will put public interest first. Now, reduction of ferry service and so on, there needs to be approval from the Transport Department. And I've asked the Commission for Transport to put residents' interest first when considering the application. Mr. Eddie Chu. But the question is, Ma Wan residents are being held hostage by developers. Now, you say that the Transport Department may approve or not approve it, but that's not enough as gatekeeping. The Ma Wan residents want the government to take up the responsibility that as the bus service or the ferry service should be taken up by the government instead. Now, if I don't think that's appropriate. There's every time if someone breaks the rules and then government will take it up, then that will be immense moral hazards. We must go by the contract because for the Ma Wan development, there is a contract governing the development, so we must go by the contract. But for Ma Wan residents, if they want to arrange their own coach services, there are rules to follow. There are established rules, and the Transport Department could help to make it happen. We'll be happy to do that. Dr. Junius Ho. Before I came into the chamber, Chief Executive, I was going to ask you this. That is relaxing the restrictions on solar power facilities on the rooftop of village houses. I was going to ask it, but just before I came to chamber, something happened, and so I thought that's more important, and I'd like to share with you. When the lift door opened, I saw Mr. James Toh all worked up, arguing with security guards. How come I have to stand here? How come I must let the Chief Executive go first? Now, it's not a question of the rank. You know, as a gentleman should always let the lady go first. So that leads me to the very important question about manners. Mr. James, so what is your point of order? No, just now is that he didn't let me walk at all. No, that's not a point of order. Dr. Ho, please come back. So my question is all about manners. Hong Kong is a world city in Asia, but it's a crowded place, and as you are right to point out that we should strive, respect our differences and try for common ground. But if we could all have such understanding, things would go smoothly. But then there are many distorted arguments these days. For example, at the beginning of a school year, some students say they want to learn to be someone who not so, polite, or well, aren't we trying to teach students to have all-round development so anyway, my question is, we are spending so much on education. We want to nurture students. It's not just about STEM. About manners is important as well. So would the Chief Executive ask the Education Bureau to put more focus on moral education so Hong Kong could become a polite city, world city in Asia? Chief Executive, Dr. Ho, my education philosophy is about all-round development. So how can we train our next generation to have social commitments, to have a sense of responsibility, to have to be upright and so on, and polite and all that. But of course, at the same time, we need parents to support us. And in this council, well, you have your own rules. I'm not going to intervene on what you do. But if we just talk about education philosophy, yes, what you say, we all agree. Dr. Ho, on all-round education, I'm glad to hear that it's also your philosophy. So will you take the lead and or even give an with your government officials, or even give it an opportunity for members of this council to join politeness campaign, because it's always nice to be polite to others. Now, I have full respect for the rules of this council. I have no intention to intervene, but I and my officials, we always treat people with courtesy.
Legislative Council, really. Now, Liu Xia never committed one crime, but then she was found guilty by association, because and now the wife and then the widow of Liu Xiaobo, China's Nobel Peace winner. She was persecuted. We all knew it. She was put under house arrest and went through all kinds of ordeals, and her persistent plight had prompted calls from the international community for her release, including Germany, of course. She was finally released as an obvious political pawn, a diplomatic favor. Now, after all the outrages perpetrated, the hostage was released, and our Mrs. Carrie Lam had the cheek to actually call it, and I quote, an expression of humanitarianism, unquote. Why did you make that statement on behalf of Hong Kong people? And exactly how and what do you mean?
I meant what I said.
Chief Executive.
Because you are very good at English, you should know that that particular phrase has no object, has no subject. So this is just a description of what I have seen that is an act of humanitarianism. I have nothing more to add, Mr. President.
Ms. Claudia Mo.
Carrie Lam told the Financial Times of London that she wouldn't mind being called a Beijing shoeshiner. Are you indeed a Beijing groveler?
No, in her usual style, Ms. Mo has
Chief Executive.
comment out of context. I was asked in that Financial Times interview, could I name one leader of the world that I admired? I said yes, even running the risk of being accused of shoe-shining President Xi. I said President Xi Jinping is one of the world leaders, or is the world leader that I respected and admired most.
毛孟靜議員，你嘅時間已經到咗。葉劉淑儀議員。
Ms. Claudia Mo, your time's up. Mrs. Regina Yip. Thank you, President. I would like to ask about housing and land. On the first anniversary of assuming office, the Chief Executive announced the new housing initiatives, the 3 objectives and 6 measures. At the same time, the Chief Executive also said that she is well aware that such measures will not bring about immediate increase in land supply or curb of property prices. But of course, when these measures were announced, the people still welcome them. Because you're talking about bigger discounts of GSH and so on. But then the property prices are bound to continue to rise. Now, also there are various there's a new stamp duty measure, but many people could evade it. There's a survey. Now, if people buy companies, including the celebrities, they're able to evade some $90 billion in stamp duty. And also, buyers' stamp duty has gone up substantially because the property prices are so expensive, so this additional duty amount to nothing. But I'm glad to hear from the Chief Executive that you're not going to rule out a restriction order on flat purchase. I think that's essential. It will also counter the unfair argument that mainlanders are pushing up property prices. Now, if only permanent residents could buy certain flats, then you could remove the buyer stamp duty and address many of the inadequacies in that respect. Also, it will dampen the expectation that property prices will keep soaring and never fall. Well, you say you won't rule out this possibility, but at what stage would you actually consider it? Because in many other mainland cities, there's already this restriction. Chief Executive, I hope Mrs. Ip would see this. For the property market in Hong Kong, there are many uncertainties, external factors and other speculation. So that's why there are movements in the markets. Now, as the Chief Executive, and I'm sure I'm saying this on behalf of the Financial Secretary as well, on property market developments or government policies, we shouldn't be too specific. Otherwise, people may take our words out of context or speculate on our intentions and then push up property prices again. So we want to meet the housing demands of Hong Kong people. We will not rule out any options. We'll monitor the situation closely, and when necessary, we will respond accordingly.
Mrs. Ip, I do understand and sympathize with the concerns of the Chief Executive. Since the global economic and other aspects are not very clear, of course, Mrs. Lam would not like to cause the property market to have a very negative effect. But what about subdivided units? Recently, the Housing Panel conducted a hearing on subdivided units. I was shocked to hear a deputation saying that they have to pay $9,000 for a very small subdivided flat. Can the CE consider making new regulations to control rent at subdivided units and also to take care of other management issues? Some people say this can be done according to the districts, but it's not possible because subdivided units are all over the place. Well, you can ask the law draftsman at the DOJ to see whether you can have a separate ordinance to control the rent of subdivided units. CE. Mrs. Ip's question is only related to subdivided units, but I think the core of the issue is rent control. I'm aware that at this council, when we discuss housing problems and also difficulties for grassroots and also spiraling of rent, you are asking that the government can consider rent control and legislating for it. But as we have always said, when there is such a scarce supply of housing units, any rent control may be counterproductive. The market may offer even fewer units for people in need. So today we still have that view. We cannot lightly approach this. Otherwise, grassroots families will be even more affected. Mr. Lam Cheuk Ting. Mr. Chief Executive, 3 years ago in 2015 in July, Ms. Rebecca Lee was appointed to act in the head of operations position at the ICAC, which is the second place in the ICAC. And then 1 year later, she was terminated by Mr. Simon Pei, and there was a shock wave sent through the entire ICAC, and she resigned. After that, Mr. Ricky Yao had been acting in the head of operations position, and it has been for 2 years. So altogether, for 3 years, the post is held by people acting in it. But this position is responsible for leading the ICAC in formulating long-term anti-corruption policies, and also it has to decide on investigation directions on major cases. Now, even this acting head will not be able to make plans for his work 3 months down the road. How can he lead the ICAC in making long-term policies? Plus, the 2 directors under the head of operations, they are nearing retirement age, and they will be leaving the post by retirement at the end of the year and also early next year. So this is a problem with the 3 heads of the operations department. But Mr. Simon Pei said that he is not appointing the head of operations because even if you are a good investigator, it doesn't mean that you are a good manager. Actually, he is slighting the management ability of the highest ranking people at the ICAC. Mr. Ricky Yao, Ms. Rebecca Lee, they had held the very high positions in ICAC for over 10 years, and their contribution was very much recognized, and Mr. Simon Pei's remarks again caused outrage within the ICAC. The ICAC has 44 years of history, we have never seen such a high-ranking position held by people who are only in an acting capacity. And after reunification for 20 years, and there has never been a head of government department which has been left vacant for 3 years. Mr. Chief Executive, you are the only supervisor of Mr. Simon Pei. Will you direct him to tackle the selection of a person for holding the head of operations position as soon as possible? Chief Executive, thank you. It's usual for Mr. Lam Cheuk-ting to focus on these issues on such occasions. Well, this is about internal personnel matters of the ICAC, and it is not appropriate to discuss these issues in a public setting. So I will not be commenting on the ability of a certain person, whether another person has made the right judgment. But it's true that the commissioner of the ICAC is only responsible to me. That is why I meet him regularly. In our latest meeting, I mentioned to him internal personnel matters, and also we should have good personnel succession plans to ensure the operation of the ICAC. But I will not particularly teach him what to do, because anyone who is the head of a department will put the interests of the organization and stability of the organization first. I'm sure Mr. Pei is already dealing with it. Mr. Lam Cheuk-ting, President. This is the first time the Chief Executive has responded that she has taken up personnel issues at the ICAC with Mr. Simon Pei, the Commissioner. I think this has been dragging on for too long. It has been 3 years without anyone selected. Mrs. Lam, you have been in government for 40 years. I'm sure you haven't seen such a high and important position which has been left vacant for 3 years. This is not any run-of-the-mill personnel issue, but it is a matter of public interest. So, Mrs. Lam, I hope you will again instruct Simon Pei to make arrangements for personnel succession in the operations department of the ICAC. Actually, Mr. Simon Pei is not the appropriate person to be the commissioner. Please, your time is up. Please sit down. Mrs. Lam, well, I have already responded. I'd like to clarify that I was not talking about teaching him to tackle personnel issues. I was just saying that as an organization, there are many issues to be tackled, one of which is personnel succession in the high ranks. Mr. Simon Pei, being the head of that organization, will be able to make a decision on his assessment of the performance of his colleagues. Mr. Ho Kai-ming, we'd like to develop local community economy so that we can have in-depth tourism to promote tourism and culture. Last week, Wong Tai Sin Am Chin Wai village was found to be an important heritage item. And in fact, there is also a lot of heritage items nearby, including Long Chun Bridge and also Song Wong Toi and also Kowloon City. Today, Am Chin Wai village can showcase Hong Kong's history before we were developed. I'd like to ask you whether you will allow in situ preservation. And in the last week, the District Council has already said that they would like to preserve Am Chin Wai village and also for comprehensive preservation. Thank you, Mr. Jonathan Ho. As I was answering another question, when we talk about city development today, we need to strike a balance. We need to have development, but at the same time, we like to preserve Hong Kong's city landscape and also our heritage. Specifically, what should we preserve in Am Chin Wai village? I think it should be up to the Urban Renewal Authority to consider. I'm sure the URA has heard the voices of the community and the District Council. When I was the Secretary for Development, I participated in urban renewal, and I remember we would have to conserve Am Chin Wai village. But now there are new developments. I don't know whether the conservation program will have to be revised, and I will leave it to the URA. Mr. Jonathan Ho, Chief Executive, why don't you go for a site visit? Would you be able to find the time to go for a site visit together with some professors so that you know the history of Am Chin Wai village from the Song Dynasty? Chief Executive, I hope I have more time to go around. But the fact is, this may be the last sitting of the council today, but I will be kick-starting consultation for my policy address. I'll try if I can find the time. Mr. Yik Chi Ming, Frankie Yik, Chief Executive, there is a report saying that Hong Kong's fuel prices are the most expensive throughout the world. The Competition Commission proposed a list of measures for fuel providers to provide lower fuel prices. However, the very competitive measures have not been undertaken. We are very concerned about oligopoly in the fuel market. We already said that we should reconsider and review the land policy for petrol stations. We must ensure that there is real competition in the market. But then the tendering system for petrol stations would not be something that the Environment Bureau can tackle alone, so it cannot take up the proposal. Chief Executive, I'd like to ask this question. Well, in this question and answer session, I cannot explain in detail the views of the Liberal Party on this, but since you have always said that you will apply new thinking to the governance of the city and also you will protect the public's interest, my question for you is whether you will make use of the now reconstituted Central Policy Unit in order to make some review and bring in some reform. I would be very happy to meet with the new CPU at any time. Chief Executive, thank you, Mr. Frankie Yik. I am very happy that you will be happy to talk to the Policy Innovation and Coordination Unit, which is a successor of the CPU. I thank you for your confidence in it, and in fact, the PICO has been working very hard on policy coordination. Now, with regard to this tendering system for petrol station, you do not need to go to the PICO. The Secretary for the Environment has a lot of authority. If he doesn't, I can give him more authority. I have seen the Competition Commission's report. We will do follow-up, and other departments will also work together with the Environment Bureau. Mr. Frankie Yik, I have just read the paper for the Development Panel meeting next week, and it is clear that the Environment Policy Bureau has misunderstood our proposals. In fact, we have talked to the Competition Commission, who thinks that our proposal is feasible. But then the Environment Bureau's reply is such that they have misunderstood our proposal. I hope we can follow up. Thank you, Mr. Wong. Please try to seek an understanding with Mr. Frankie Yik what we have misunderstood. Last member, Mr. Ray Chan. On the morning of Tuesday, a reporter asked Mrs. Carrie Lam in English the administration's reply to the QT case. Actually, the question is quite similar to Mr. Horace Cheung's question this morning, and that is whether in other policy areas there would be equal treatment to LGBT spouses, or rather you would just wait and see and then we use public money to go to the court. At the time, Mrs. Lam's answer was very strange. He said that I would need to correct your question. She said that she read the ruling twice. She said that it was not about LGBT equal rights, but rather immigration policy. The judgment is about 40-odd pages long, and on every page there is this word discrimination, discriminatory, equality. And the entire QT case is about the Immigration Department not giving a dependent visa to the dependent or spouse of an LGBT resident. Well, actually, the court is very clear, saying that there's nothing to do with same-sex marriage, but this is about equal rights. And the administration cannot say that since you are not a man and a woman, since you cannot marry in Hong Kong, so absolutely you cannot enjoy the rights for hetero marriages. And you said that people should justify it. My question is, Mrs. Lam, are you still saying that the QT case is just an immigration issue and not LGBT equal rights issue? If that's the case, are you saying that the administration will not take the initiative to tackle discrimination and not take the initiative to examine other policy areas, saying that I dare you to take me to court, if I lose a case, I will just work on that particular area and nothing more? If that's the case, it's too bad. You said in the introduction that you would agree to disagree. But in fact, anti-discrimination and LGBT equal rights is about agreeing to disagree. You should not wait for the court to challenge you. You should do it with your own initiative. Chief Executive. Well, Mr. Chen, I said it very clearly. I was reading it out. I said the first paragraph in the foreword of the CFA judgment. Well, I should read it out again. It doesn't have English.
Issues concerning equality under the law, and specifically whether there has been unlawful discrimination on the part of the Director of Immigration in the administration of his policy regarding the issue of dependent visas.
So to answer that English reporter, I said that the case was not about LGBT rights per se. It's as simple as that. But to answer your question, agreeing to disagree would include the overall acceptability of the community, including views of different sectors. If you're of the view that in Hong Kong we have already forged a broad consensus to do what you think we should do, then please prove it to me. Mrs. Ray Chan, you said it very well. And the people ask me, reporters ask me, is Leung Chun-ying better or Carrie Lam better? I said Carrie Lam is worse than Leung Chun-ying in one thing, and that is about anti-discrimination for LGBT. She said nothing about it in the policy address. Leung Chun-ying said in one paragraph why he would not do it. Last week, the Hong Kong U released its most recent popularity rating survey. 70% of the people agree that there should be legislation on anti-discrimination. Please come to your question. I'm asking her, will she be tackling sexual orientation discrimination in her next policy address? At least there should be some consultation and a timetable. Sorry, anything that has to do with the 2018 policy address has to be kept confidential until the 10th of October. Thank you, President. The Chief Executive's question and answer session ends here. After the Chief Executive has left the chamber, this Council will resume its regular meeting immediately. The Chief Executive will now leave the chamber. Members will please stand up.
本會處理根據立法會權。
This Council resumes the meeting.